Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Almost all the villagers were related to each other, not by blood, but by kinship. Such people as his wife's cousin were considered the inner circle here. They were invited to all the festivities from weddings to New Year's Eve, helped them with the household chores, brought freshly baked pierogi, and shared news. The far circle didn't seem to exist at all. And where was it to come from, if there were only 3 main surnames for the whole village, and only a few dozen people who did not belong to them? Village. They were used to it. And so the news that Stephen and Thompson were going to be sent to an orphanage because he had no relatives at first stirred and surprised the village. Then, of course, they remembered. Thompson came to the village a little over 10 years ago to live and work. Young, cheerful, in love with each other, friendly, polite, and hardworking. They surprisingly easily fit into the atmosphere of the village, accepted the rules that reigned here, and became their own. It happens that even after 50 years, one of the newcomers is perceived as a stranger. But the couple and Thompson were considered locals after 2 years and were surprised when it turned out that they did not know about some important events of 5 years ago. The young couple lived amicably both among themselves and with their neighbors. Little by little, they organized the household, put in order the old hut, allocated to them by the collective farm. He worked as a veterinarian. She worked as a teacher. Soon they gave birth to a son, Stephen, with whom all the old ladies of the neighborhood willingly married. There were no grandmothers in the family for some reason. Thompson himself said that he was an orphanage, and his wife never mentioned her parents, and she carefully avoided questions on the subject. Then it was decided that both spouses were from the orphanage. But the teacher Thompson, for some reason, shy to talk about it, or simply does not like to remember. But they stopped asking questions. If a man doesn't want to tell, there's no need to pull this soul out of him. And how it really was, the village learned only years later, after the veterinarian and his wife were killed by a car and their son, 10-year-old Stephen, was left an orphan. The couple were buried by the whole village. The organization of the mournful event was undertaken by the head of the village council, his neighbors on the street, and the same neighbors helped him. In the first few days, he groomed the green. They fed him, took him to their homes for the night, or stayed with him in the empty houses, sent him to school, checked his lessons, at the same time watched over the household, which was left from the spouses. A 10-year-old boy could not manage with pigs and a cow. They did not think much about the boy's fate. They habitually thought that someone from the family would appear and take custody of him. But instead of relatives, there was a local district police officer, asked the neighbor to take care of him at that moment in the hut and help with finding some documents. He explained that he was preparing papers to send Stephen to an orphanage. I wanted to talk to Stephen himself about it. Yeah. The neighbor said no. Don't let the boy make a fuss, she said. He'd better look through his own channels. Maybe he's got some relatives left in this world. Rick, of course, was in an orphanage. And maybe he has brothers, sisters, relatives somewhere. And we don't know anything about Miranda. Maybe she's an orphan, maybe not. What if she has one, or a grandmother, or even a niece? Look for her and be a friend. And if you don't find any, ask our people. Maybe someone will take Stephen into their family, get custody. He's not a stranger to us. After all, he's ours, he's his own. And you can always put him in an orphanage. It didn't take long to persuade the district police officer. Being in the 5th generation, one could say indigenous, he was accustomed to perceive his fellow villagers as one big family. He regarded Stephen as something like a 5th nephew, and was not at all eager to hand him over to the care of the state. It was up to his superiors to demand it. But having served 20 years in the police, he had already learned to let some of the requests of his superiors go on the brakes, if the matter was worth it. And now, having stipulated the sudden difficulty in finding Thompson's documents, the village policeman conducted his own little investigation. Thompson had indeed been brought up in an orphanage, where his own mother had surrendered him immediately after his birth. Traces of his parent had been lost, and it was impossible to find her. And there was no point in looking for her. If the woman refused her own son, she would hardly be interested in her grandson. But Miranda's parents were easy to find. It was only necessary to submit a request for her maiden name Turner in the city from where the couple came to the village. Not only parents, but 2 older siblings with husbands and families, and a maternal grandmother, Evelyn. Finding such a crowd of close relatives for Stephen, the precinct officer was encouraged. One of them would surely take the boy in, he thought. But after a few calls around town, his hopes were dashed. At Miranda's parents' apartment, his mother answered the phone. She took the news about the tragic death of her youngest daughter rather coolly, but politely thanked for the information. But Kolka laughed wryly at the offer to take her grandson to her. "Do you think I need this trick?" she asked, confused. And what else was missing? "I'm not in the habit of bringing dirt into the house." Stunned by this reaction, the village policeman tried to contact Miranda and Thompson. But even here he was met with failure. One of the women sighed sincerely about her sister's death, but she refused to take the tape, saying she had no time to raise a child. "My husband and I are geologists," she explained sadly. "We are always on expeditions, traveling. We are at home only 2 months a year. We can't have a child of our own with this rhythm of life. How can we take responsibility for someone else's child who has been through such a trauma?" The second sister was more abrupt. "Even the rude Miranda child is Miranda on the problems," she said. "She has never helped me with my difficulties. So why should I behave any differently?" "But Miranda is dead," cautiously reminded the interlocutor of the militiaman. "She can't solve her own problems if she wants to. You should have thought of that earlier, when you were going to have a baby with no one." Without family support, the woman cut off and hung up. The policeman, dumbfounded, shook his head and dialed the number of the parents' apartment again. This time, the phone was picked up by the father of the family. To the surprise of the policeman, he completely repeated the reaction of his wife. Coldly thanked for information about the fate of his youngest daughter, and dismissively, even somewhat insulted, refused to participate in the fate of her son. What to do next, the district police officer did not know. The behavior of Miranda's relatives did not fit into his picture of the world, and that prevented him from thinking and making normal decisions. But he understood one thing for sure: to suggest to his fellow villagers that Stephen be adopted or that he be given guardianship in such a situation was impossible. The boy had blood relatives, and they would certainly surface when someone started to register him in their family. Stephen will want to meet them, and the refusal will finally throw the boy out of favor. But they'll be talking about this family's behavior for years to come. And how will that talk affect Stephen? It's hard to predict. But to put the boy in an orphanage with living titles and divisions of great-grandparents is wrong, ridiculous, cruel. In the end, the man puzzled for several hours over what he should do in this situation, how to do better for the boy, whom he himself used to consider a distant relative. His thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. "Hello," said in the receiver a harsh old voice. "Did you call the apartment? My name is Evelyn. I want to know where my great-grandson Stephen Thompson is, and how can I meet him?" 2 days later, Stephen Evelyn's great-grandmother arrived in the village with a huge suitcase. From her, the policemen and the rest of the villagers gradually learned the story of the young teacher's family. Turner, Miranda's parents, were a well-to-do, educated, and even well-to-do family. But one day Miranda, Father Curiosity, for the sake of curiosity, thought to compile his genealogical tree, and in the process of researching archives, found out that one of his great-grandmothers, unknown how many times, came from a noble family. Roth was united, and besides not too noble. His eldest daughter, in order to improve the family fortune and give the younger sisters and brothers to arrange their lives, was given in marriage to a rich merchant, and her children, accordingly, passed into the merchant class. But this did not embarrass the young explorer. He fancied himself a bearer of noble blood and began to change his life accordingly. Worse, he infected his idea's spouse daughter, Evelyn. The mother, however, Miranda, as well as her older sisters, at that time was not even in the project. The newly minted nobleman introduced into life aristocratic habits in the form in which he understood them. For example, he got himself a terry robe, in which he went out to breakfast in the morning, began to call his mother-in-law maman in the French manner. He stopped communicating with several good friends because he considered their origin not noble enough. And of course, he dreamed of a son and heir to the family. But alas, a son never wanted to appear. With the first child, the man let the matter drop. For the second, he and his wife carefully calculated the date of conception on some tables found in the newspaper. But they must have miscalculated somewhere. Once again, a daughter was born. Daughters Turner, of course, picked up classical names and brought them up in accordance with the noble tradition, which he learned from classic novels. The girls from a young age had a governess, teaching them the rules of etiquette, needlework, and French. All of them attended art and music schools and ballroom dancing, and for each of them in advance was selected a groom from familiar families, whose family tree suited their father. For the birth of the third child, Turner prepared thoroughly. He consulted with several doctors, read a lot of scientific and pseudoscientific articles on planning the sex of the future baby. He sat for several months on some smart diet, performed daily gymnastics and breathing exercises, made up a schedule of sex with his wife to accumulate male seed in the body and drain the female seed, as advised by one of the theories he had studied. His wife also adhered to a certain diet, once a week performed some rituals, decorated the bedroom in blue colors to attract male energy. In short, the preparation was on all fronts. The stronger was the disappointment when their third daughter was born. The couple even wanted to leave her in the maternity hospital, but Evelyn managed to dissuade the new parents from this idea. At least somewhere this nonsense with nobility came in handy, recalled the old woman's son-in-law, told him that leaving a native child to fate is unworthy of a true aristocrat. Icons. He thought about it. Otherwise, goodness wouldn't convince. The girl was named Miranda and tried to bring up in the same traditions as her older sisters. But these attempts were not successful. The little girl from early childhood had a combative and Zedorknoy character, grew her free-spirited and stubborn. Apparently, Turner's efforts to give birth to a boy did not go completely in vain. Anechka's temperament was truly boyish. No, she did not grow up under a female. She was just an ordinary, active, and inquisitive child who learns the world with interest. Even as a toddler on walks, Miranda was unwilling to stroll gracefully by the hand with her governess through the yard or the square. She with a joyful squeal ran along the paths, crawled on her knees on the lawn, looking at some strange bugs, enthusiastically picking in the sandbox or climbing low trees. Slightly grown up, the girl resolutely sabotaged art school. In music school, transferred without asking parents from the piano class to the guitar class, and instead of ballroom dancing enrolled in the tourism section. From childhood, Miranda did only what she wanted to do. And no punishments from her father, no sermons from her mother that some activities and habits of behavior are unworthy of a well-behaved girl from a good family could not change that. Already disliked the youngest daughter for being born a girl, and her free-spirited nature only served to alienate Miranda from the family. Worst of all was the girl's blatant disregard for the aristocratic origins of her family. Miranda sincerely and openly laughed at her father when he started talking about his nobility and ancestry. She believed that in the 20th century, the century of scientific and technological progress, so boast of pedigree can only sweep retrograde. And to build a way of life equal to the ancestors of aristocrats would be crazy. Miranda more than once told her father about it, then provoked disputes that quickly turned into scandals. Of the whole family supported the girl only her grandmother. Her mother shared her father's ideas. The sisters, it seems, did not even occur to them that parents could be crossed or act in their own way, and Miranda lived the life she wanted. Her mother threw away her camping equipment. The girl took it out of trash cans and took it to her friends for safekeeping, and her father restricted her pocket money. Miranda found part-time jobs, turned in recyclable materials, embroidered various trifles, and sold them to a classmate. The girl was put under house arrest. She discouraged her grandmother to bring her more contemporary fiction from the library and immersed herself in reading. At the same time, Miranda studied well, engaged in social activities, and at school she was consistently praised. By the time she was 15 years old, her parents had not exactly resigned themselves to their daughter's character, but rather tolerated it as a necessary evil. Turner hoped that marriage will be able to tame the violent Miranda temper. Naturally, the groom for her, as well as for the two older daughters, was already provided. And the fact that this groom was 20 years older than the girl, neither father nor mother was not embarrassed at all. The main thing, he was from a kind of twisted noble family, and therefore suitable for their daughter. The marriage was planned after graduation. A noble maiden should have a higher education in some female specialty, thought Turner Sr., not technical by any means. That's a man's specialty, something light, humanitarian, more for general development than for usefulness and earnings. And earnings. Aristocratic girls don't need to think. They'll be fully provided for by their husbands. That was Miranda's father's reasoning. Therefore, the older sister of the girl for the third year rotten at the Faculty of Art, and on weekends visited theaters and museums in the company, approved by the parents of the groom. The middle sister was interested in geology and minerals, but her father had already prepared a place for her at the library faculty. Miranda's future specialty was still only planned. The girl was finishing the 8th grade, but Miranda realized that in general terms her life would be no different from her sister's, and this did not suit her at all. After graduation, she told her parents that she was going on another trip with the tourist section and disappeared from home for a few days. And then she called and reported, stunned at her father, that she took her documents from school and entered a teacher training college in a neighboring city. "It seems to me, Dad," said the girl in the tube, "that teaching is quite a suitable occupation for the youngest daughter of a noble family." Remember the classics. In the 19th century, girls from noble families often went into teaching. So I'm not breaking the family tradition at all. Miranda tried not to sound too snide. I think it's high time for me to start my own life. At my age, noble women were already getting married, and some of them had their first children. But I'm still sitting on your mother's neck. So I've decided it's time to make my own way. There's a hostel here. They gave me a room, but it's not until August. But I've arranged to move in now. It's a small stipend, but it's enough. So I'm starting my adult life. But it's zero. My badge is running out. We're about to be separated. I'll write to you and my mom, send you my address. The girl finished quickly and hung up the phone without waiting for her father's reply. It was a blow below the belt for Tomichi. The mother drank heart drops, and the father was furious, pacing the room and clenching his fists. The sisters locked themselves in their rooms, not risking to be seen by their parents. Evelyn was able to calm the adults and convince them to accept her daughter's decision. But she would enter the institute later. "It's nothing," the grandmother exhorted. "Especially after college, you can go straight to the 3rd year, so even save time. We'll see how to live independently, assess how much calmer it was under the parental wing, and return home. You'll see." "But the dormitory," Mother exclaimed. "What kind of place is that for a young girl? A life of debauchery. And what if she gets pregnant?" "That unreasonable girl," objected Evelyn gently. "She would not risk her future so much." "It seems to me, Mother, that you were involved in her escape," Turner said suspiciously. "Probably sponsored it too." Of course, Evelyn was involved. She had never shared her daughters and son-in-law's approach to child rearing and their desire to arrange the girls' lives without regard for their own wishes. And she had always adored Miranda because she saw that she could resist her father's will. But her son-in-law, of course, the old woman did not admit it. Then the peace was restored, and for the middle Miranda and sister this situation even benefited. Her parents allowed her to choose her future specialty independently, fearing that she too could jump out and run away from home. That decision was not approved, but they kept in touch with her. congratulated her on vacations, welcomed her home on vacation, and even occasionally helped her financially. But the shaky world collapsed when, just before graduation from college, the girl announced that she was marrying a good guy and leaving with him on assignment. And when she mentioned that the guy in the orphanage and her father finally lost his temper and told Miranda that she was no longer his daughter. From then on, Miranda was never mentioned in the house. She wrote to her parents a couple of times, but they tore up the envelopes without even opening them. So Evelyn did not manage to find out her granddaughter's new address in the educational section of the pedagogical school. They refused to give the elderly woman any information about the allocation. For some reason, Miranda stopped calling her father's house, so her traces were lost. Of course, you could go to the police. You could look for Miranda's classmates and find out from them something about the fiancé and the girl's new address. But Turner, sincerely offended by their daughter's behavior and the fact that she ruined their plans, were not going to do it. And Evelyn did not have the strength to actively search for her. With age, her health began to fail. Evelyn complained of vascular pain, heart, dizziness, and worries about her granddaughter only aggravated her condition. Nevertheless, when an elderly woman accidentally overheard a telephone conversation of her son-in-law and learned how the fate of her granddaughter and what future threatens her grandson, she, without a second's hesitation, packed up and came to the village. It's not a good idea to put the boy in an orphanage with living relatives, she explained to the district police officer. My daughter and my son-in-law have completely lost their nobility. They consider the boy almost a freak. But I'm still in my mind, and I'm not going to die. I'm sure I'll have enough Stephen until I'm 20. So give me a residence permit, comrade policeman. And tell me, what papers do I need to keep Stephen with me? Stephen was wary of Evelyn at first. The policeman brought her to the house in Thompson without warning immediately on the day of her arrival. He sat down opposite the boy and said, "Seriously, Stephen, here's the thing. According to the laws of our country, children under the age of 18 cannot live alone or with adults or in an orphanage. Since you don't have parents now, the law tells me to put you in an orphanage. But there's a relative of yours, your mom's grandmother. She can take custody of you, and then you can stay at home here. I understand the person. She's new to you, a stranger. But it's better to be with a new person in your home than with strangers and in a new place. Anyway, you guys stay here for a couple days, socialize, and I'll come back the day after tomorrow. Let me know. Do you want to live with your great-grandmother or do you want to leave? Whatever you decide, that's how it'll be." Stephen nodded demurely. The policeman shook his hand and left. The old woman and the boy were left alone. For a while they looked at each other in silence. Then Evelyn spoke. "My name is Evelyn," she said. "You can call me Evelyn if you like." And then she inquired in a businesslike manner, "Are you hungry?" "Not really, I guess," Stephen said uncertainly. He had expected a serious conversation about the rest of his life, but not about the hassle. About food. "When did you eat the last time?" Grandma kept up. "At lunchtime at school." After some thought, the boy answered, "That's 12 o'clock." So Stephen nodded. "And now it's already 6 o'clock in the evening." "That's not the point. Come on, Stephen, let's get you something for dinner. You team tell me where you keep what, how to use it, what utensils you can use, what you can't use for the host in general. I'll do the cooking." Stephen. It was flattering that Evelyn recognized him as master and promised to obey him. He feared that the strange old woman would immediately set her own rules in the house, which, of course, would be different from the rules adopted by his parents. And then the whole household would be destroyed. The remnants of his familiar, quiet, happy life would be lost forever, and it would become finally clear that his father and mother had gone away for good and would never return. From the day of the funeral, Stephen had decided to behave as if his mother and father had gone away on a long business trip and left him to look after the house and the household. Such an attitude helped him not to write the news that he might be taken away to an orphanage. Scared the boy, But then he thought, if the sudden great-grandmother will start to run the house in her own way and destroy everything that was created by his parents, then maybe the orphanage is not such a bad thing. He will not be able to resist her. But to live next to her and watch the familiar world being destroyed piece by piece every day, he won't be able to either. Of course, Stephen didn't think exactly like that. For a 10-year-old boy, such reasoning is still a bit difficult, but that's how he felt, and that's why he watched Evelyn's actions cautiously. The old woman, however, behaved carefully. She did obey all of her grandson's instructions, and in the process of cooking managed to get him talking. Stephen started with the smallest things: which pan should be used to fry potatoes, which knife to use to cut bread, and which knife to use to cut meat, on which shelf of the refrigerator to store a can of milk. But soon the boy was already talking excitedly about how they lived with his father and mother, what they were into, how they spent their time, and how they socialized. Evelyn listened, asked questions, where she sympathized, where she laughed, and where she told her story of Miranda Stephen's childhood to her mother, not forgetting to mention how she and the boy were similar in character. During the conversation, they finished dinner, drank tea, moved into the room to the sofa, where Stephen eventually fell asleep, resting his head on his great-grandmother's lap. And when he woke up in the middle of the night, he found her sitting over him, stroking his head and whispering something like, "Bayou, what are you doing?" Surprised the boy. "Lie down. It's nighttime." "Yes, that's something," thought Stephen, answered the old woman, embarrassed. "So good you fell asleep. It was a pity to wake you up, to disturb you. And where to go for treatment, I don't know." Come on," Stephen said sternly. "At night you should sleep lying in bed, not sitting up, to rest your body and gain strength," he said in an instructive tone, obviously imitating one of the adults. "Come on, I'll show you to your room." Stephen took Evelyn to the room, which was considered a guest room in the house. He helped her unmake the bed. After some thought, he brought a second blanket. "It's getting chilly at night," he explained businesslike. "Thank you, you're a thoughtful guy." Evelyn smiled. "I can't help it," Stephen said judiciously. "Since it's just the two of us, we'll take care of each other." He said it, and he was surprised at himself. He had not known Evelyn for 24 hours before, but now, after the long conversation, after the sincere interest and respect of this strange old woman for his family and his world, after the way she had carefully and touchingly taken care of his sleep, this Evelyn felt more dear to him than anyone else in the world, and he agreed to live with her and take care of her. As a grandson of a grandmother or a great-grandmother should be cared for, it didn't matter. That's what Stephen reported to the police station 2 days later. And not once, after all the years of living with Evelyn, did not regret this decision. The village discussed Miranda's story for a long time. It did not fit into the worldview of the locals. But Evelyn was quickly accepted and considered her own. In Callanan's opinion, she had done the right and logical thing. You have a family, so take care of it. Helping your children and grandchildren, no matter what mistakes they made, no matter how stupid you think they are. I don't like to be persuaded and educated like that. You can give us children, but don't leave them to their fate, and don't break their character. That's the way they reasoned in the village. Of course, this did not mean that in every Callanan yard reigned peace of prosperity. After all, this is not a fairy tale village, but a real one. There were quarrels, scandals, and fights. And even in flogging a child or dragging him by the ears for disobedience was not seen as anything special. But every villager knew that if anything happened, the whole family would help and support him. That is, half of the village. And what else does a man need if not the assurance of a strong rear and the existence of a place where he will always be accepted and supported? Not much, really. Stephen Thompson grew up a quiet and sensible lad. He was respected in the village, and often even grown men turned to him for advice and help. Accustomed from childhood to consider himself the master of the house and to take care of Evelyn, the boy gradually learned everything that was required for life in the village and acquired a calm, confident, and slightly patronizing manner, which extended to everyone with whom he interacted. The one thing the lad flatly refused to deal with was automobiles. He did not want not to learn to drive, not to understand their structure, underlyingly considering auto technicians his sworn enemy. After all, it was because of her that he once lost his parents. For a long time, he refused to drive cars, and only at the age of 14 he began to sit quietly in the passenger seat. But this punctiliousness and fellow villagers forgave him, considering it more of a harmless oddity than a consequence of a serious childhood trauma. Did not like his life, like the village where he grew up from childhood, and the house left by his parents. He sincerely loved his grandmother and worried about her. And so his plans for life after graduation were simple and ingenuous: to go to work in the village collective farm, and to continue to take care of the Tom and his piece of land to the best of his ability. However, Evelyn was not satisfied with these plans. Already after the 9th grade, she began to persuade her great-grandson to go to the city and enroll there in a school for workers without a specialty. In the collective farm, at least shovel, she said, because no one really appreciates them, and they are paid pennies. A specialist with a profession is a different story, and you'll have a better place, a more serious attitude, and a higher salary. You and I don't need a lot of money now. But when you get married and have a family and kids, your expenses will increase. I don't plan to get married yet. Stephen waved it off. And cute, laughed Evelyn. It's such a thing, it can't be predicted. Today you do not plan, but tomorrow you plan. So what? The boy jokingly interrogated. And that you have to be prepared for it in advance. Great-grandmother was getting angry. And anyway, what if life turns out to be different if you leave the village? It will be easier to find a job in a new place if you have a profession on your hands. Go study. The Kolkos won't get rid of you. Evelyn had these conversations regularly. And finally, she managed to convince Stephen. True, the boy with his usual thoroughness first consulted with some of his fellow villagers, whose opinion he especially valued, and then asked the chairman of the collective farm about what specialties were in short supply. And at the end of the day, he made a deal with his neighbors and secured their promises to look after Evelyn during the week while he was at school. Only then Stephen Thompson went to town and applied for a welding apprenticeship. Evelyn approved of the specialty. A good trade, she said. Versatile. Not only in the village you can find a place, but also in the city if life demands. And you'll never be out of work. About having to look for a place in the city or in some other village than the village. Stephen refused to even think about it then. 5 days a week he lived in the dormitory at the vocational school. In the mornings he went to classes. In the evenings he worked part-time as a janitor at the kindergarten nearby. You can't eat on a stipend alone. On Friday evening, the guy ran to the station to catch the last bus to the village, to help his great-grandmother with household chores, to please her with hotels, to bring the ordered medicines, and just to be at home. Back to the city, he would return on Monday on the first morning bus to be in time for classes. That's how the first year went for school, and the second year everything changed. At the beginning of September, the boy came to the library of the college for a set of textbooks. There, as always on such days, there was noise and crowding. Having made his way to the counter, Stephen showed the librarian his student card. What group? Older. That's the third window over there. That's where we have the intern working today. Dickhead. So get ready, you won't be out of here for another hour. Thompson went to the third window and saw a young girl with a confused face behind it. Soared at the risk of Rosneft. She was trying to collect sets of textbooks for 3 different specialties at the same time, give out the collected textbooks, answer questions and maintain silence and order in the queue. Naturally, she was doing just about nothing. So the girl was clearly on the verge of hysterics. Stephen looked at her, and in his head Evelyn's voice sounded audibly. Marriage, my dear. It's a thing that can't be predicted. One day you don't plan to marry, and the next day you do. The boy waved his head as if to ward off an obsession, and then suddenly, unexpectedly for himself, He swung sharply across the bar separating the hall and landed right under the feet of the unfortunate intern. "Hello," he said, rising. "Hi, Stephen. And what's your name?" "Lisa." Stunned, said the girl. "How are you? You can't come in here." "Lisa, nice to meet you." Stephen paid no attention to her attempts at indignation. "Lisa, let me help you. I see our troubles are weighing on your mind right now. I suggest we divide up the duties. You collect the kits on the list, and I'll issue them. I know how to fill out the forms, don't worry. Are you lost in your racks? It's coming." Before the girl nodded confusedly, Thompson had already settled down at the issuing window, lined up a column behind a barrier of ATT workers, and strictly told them not to make any noise. "Who will break the silence and order will get the books with the very last," sternly informed the guy. "Lisa, where do you have ready sets?" "That's good. Your student card." He turned to the first one standing behind the barrier. The work boiled over. The girl tried to watch her sudden assistant for a while, but then rushed to the storage room to get the missing textbooks. 3 hours later, the crowd in the library hall had dissipated. Only a few people remained. Stephen straightened his back, stretched sweetly, and smiled at Lisa. "Well, I helped you through the main influx of customers," he said with a smile. "Now only the latecomers will go, 2 people at a time. I'm sure you can handle them." "Thank you," mumbled the girl, embarrassed. "It's my first day here today. I did not even know that I would get to the distribution. Otherwise, I would have prepared the kits in advance. And so I don't orient myself to anyone. What books are entitled? I don't know. I'd be lost without you. How can I thank you?" "Marry me," Stephen said quite seriously. "But if you're not ready, we can take a walk after work. You finish at 5. So I'll meet you." Shell bowed, jumped over the barrier separating the librarian's workplace from the main hall, and walked out, not forgetting his stack of textbooks. The first walk was followed by a second, and then a third. Soon the visits of the young people became regular. Stephen almost stopped talking to his fellow students. There was no time left for that. He quit the kindergarten, freeing up his evenings for meetings with Lisa, and began to work part-time at night unloading railroad cars. Tired as hell, he went from honor students to 6th graders, but he still wouldn't let himself get any C's. Fortunately, sitting at the desks of the school was soon replaced by industrial practice at the factory. There it was easier to maintain vigor and activity. Yes, and to study his specialty, Stephen finally became really interesting. Only one thing in his life remained unchanged: time from Friday evening to Monday morning, the guy always spent in the village. Lisa didn't mind. She was touched by the young man's devotion to the only native woman in his life. The girl knew the history of Lincoln and his family and sympathized with the tragedy that the boy had suffered as a child. However, even if it had not been for that tragedy, Lisa would not have prevented Thompson's visits to the village. She herself had only her mother in her family. She had never seen her father. He was quite casual and hardly knew of her existence. The grandparents had died long before she was born. Her mother had no siblings, and her cousins and 3 siblings were scattered across the country and hardly ever got in touch. Lisa had a lifelong fear that her mother would one day be gone and she would be all alone. She saw echoes of this fear in Stephen, and so treated his regular absences to the countryside with understanding. Tearful mother. Thompson met at the end of September, and as something surprisingly quickly became friends with her. And on New Year's Eve, he took the women to the village to introduce them to Evelyn and celebrate the holiday. Evelyn approved of her great-grandson's choice. She is a good girl, serious, modest, responsible, not like our local ponytails. When almost at the New Year's table for the first time seriously talked about the wedding. Before that, Lisa, though she was in love with the battleship, had taken her suitor's words about marriage lightly. But having visited the village, having got acquainted with the woman, and having seen how Stephen behaves in his house on his plot, how he communicates with neighbors, how he takes care of his grandmother and her mother, the guest of his house suddenly realized that she could not find a better husband. With this guy, she will be like behind a stone wall. He would be safe and secure. And the fear of being alone one day can be forgotten forever. Only one thing troubled Lisa, her fiance's intention to return to the village after graduation. She had nothing against rural life, and she liked the village, and the prospect of living under the same roof with Evelyn did not promise any difficulties. But he, she said, was interfering strongly with the argument as to whether the wedding should be in May or whether she should listen to a common superstition and postpone it until June. Let's solve one important issue. You've always said that family is the most important thing for you, and that's why you want to live with your family, with your grandmother here in the village. But family's important to me too, and my family is my mom, and I can't leave her alone in the city and move somewhere else without her. I feel like it would be a betrayal, and I can't take her with me. She has a job there, friends, a familiar way of life. She's a city girl to the core. She won't fit in the country. That's why I want to tell you right away that we'll live with my mom or near my mom and no other way. I'm sorry. If you're happy with that, we can go back to discussing the wedding. Lisa lowered her eyes and blushed. The words were not easy for her to say, but she had thought that once she had spoken, she would be relieved. However, now the girl was gripped by fear. What if her lover now refuses to marry her? What will she do then? Why is he silent? Lord, but why does he keep silent? While Stephen was frantically thinking what to say to this speech, Evelyn took the floor. Well done, she said. Well done, girl. You can see you've grown up a good daughter, loving, responsible, and asked the question in time. That's right. Such things should be decided on the shore. If you want to know my opinion, the Bible says that a man shall be molded from his father and mother and shall be molded to his wife. You see, you chose your wife, so be with her at one and don't break her under yourself. But you should stick to her and follow her. That's if we consider the question from a moral point of view, and if it's practical. Of course, I'll be glad to have Stephen around. But if he goes to the city, I won't get there in a year or so. On the contrary, I'm used to coping on my own. And my neighbors are close by. If anything, always help. You'll come to visit for a weekend, once a month is good. And the rest. Don't worry about me, Stephen. Just worry about yourself. You really won't mind if I stay in town? Stephen asked, cautiously relieved. The wedding was set for May. The first day they celebrated in town with friends and Lisa and Emily's mother. The second day we went to the village, and there we had a feast for great-grandmother, neighbors, friends. In short, for almost half the village. The morning after the feast, Evelyn, having served breakfast, looked at the newlyweds with tenderness and said, "Well, I've raised you. You're all grown up now. You have your own family. Soon the children will come. You won't be left alone. Now you won't be afraid to die." He and Lisa began to object to the great-grandmothers. "It's too early to die. Who are we going to visit on weekends? Who will help with the children? Who will teach us everything?" Evelyn listened to their objections, smiling as adults do when listening to children's babble, and shook her head slightly. She died a month after her great-grandson's wedding, June 1991. She waited for Stephen's next weekend visit, fed him dinner, listened to the latest news, kissed him goodnight, went to bed, and didn't wake up in the morning. Evelyn is 95 years old. The death of her great-grandmother shocked Thompson. Somehow Evelyn, despite her advanced age and numerous illnesses, seemed eternal to the lad. He had gotten used to the idea that she, who had once saved him from loneliness, who had become his support and encouragement, who had taught him everything, would always be there for him and with her forever. His parents' house a piece of his childhood that he wanted so badly to keep. Stephen blamed himself for failing to take care of his grandmother properly, abandoned her, did not keep her safe with longing and acute pain in his soul. The boy thought about the necessity of pounding the house in which he and his grandmother lived and leaving it unattended. Of course, no one in the village will not climb into it and ruin it. It is understandable. But any villager knows that empty houses fall into disrepair very quickly. You can walk, look after, water the flowers on the windows, and sweep away the dust. In the summer, you can paint the lot, and in the winter, you can squeeze the furnace and throw snow off the roof. It doesn't help if there isn't a permanent resident in the house. It is as if he is aging. Then he gets in, starts to get sick, and slowly dies. You go into it after a few years and the walls are in place, and the furniture is the same, and the painting. On the walls hang familiar ones, but the air is heavy and dead, and the shadows in the corners are frowning, and everything seems alien and unfamiliar. And how much not to air such a house, how much not to clean it. Without adding light, this lifeless atmosphere cannot be driven out. Legomko several times has been in such abandoned houses and did not want his parents' house to repeat their fate. However, Thompson could not suffer long for his great-grandmother, the end of his childhood, and his parents' house. August 1991, and all moral torment and mental problems were pushed to the background. They were overshadowed by the banal and completely unromantic need to survive. Stephen Thompson was returning home from a tour of duty. For more than 5 years, he had worked for a company that built oil storage tanks. He would go to some remote part of the country, most often to the north, and spend 3 months at a time. Then he returned home for a month, communicated with his relatives, brought his paycheck, did some household chores, and generally got back a little in body and soul from the endless frosts and the workplace. A month for this was not always enough, especially in terms of mental rest. Life away from his family was hard for Stephen, but there was no other way out. The shift paid well, and not badly. And in the city where he lived with his wife and mother-in-law. Even now, 7 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they could not offer such salaries. And in the very early 90s, there were no salaries at all. Just promises. Stephen did not like to remember those times as hard and hopelessly bleak. There was always no money in the house. Food was very simple and scarce, and the need, for example, to fix broken shoes provoked a real financial crisis. He then turned around as best he could, grabbing any part-time jobs from welder to loader. He was good at almost everything. In the first year, he used the house in the village instead of a dacha, served the whole vegetable garden with potatoes, and in the fall sold it to neighbors and colleagues of his wife and mother-in-law. Well, and recorded for the winter for his own, of course. This endless race for every penny exhausted the guy, but it seemed to him at the time that he was coping. His women are clothed, not hungry, no debts. Even the rent is paid neatly and on time. It is only necessary to wait a little. When the situation in the country will stabilize, it will be easier to go through a difficult period. Of course, waiting for better times at his factory in Thompson, he was not going to. He was in constant search for a more profitable job. But when one of his buddies told him about the shift work, Stephen at first refused. It's not so bad that we have to leave our family for a few months, he thought at the time. A few days later, however, an event occurred that changed his point of view. He remembered that day well. Lisa, who had lately been sort of nervous and brooding at the same time, had returned from work very early. Pale, weak, and suddenly very tired. She mumbled, "I don't feel well. I'm going to lie down," and disappeared into her room. Stephen fussed. Then he offered water, food, tea, some medicine. He tried to ask her where it hurt. Lisa replied that she just needed to rest, and soon she did doze off. But when Stephen stopped by an hour later to see if everything was all right, he saw a blood stain spreading across his wife's light-colored pants. "Uterine bleeding," said someone in his head and voice. It got scary. He pushed his wife, but she was surprisingly calm. While Stephen rushed to call an ambulance, Lisa tidied herself and the bed. She changed her clothes, sat down next to her husband, and calmly said, "Don't worry, everything is fine. Really, it will go away tomorrow. And if it doesn't, why is it not on time at all? There's so much blood." Stephen was confused. Lisa, too, looked confused and bewildered, and a little frightened. "Stephen," after a moment's silence, she said at last, I didn't want you to know, but as it happens, I was pregnant and had an abortion today." The man remained silent, dumbfounded. Lisa continued cautiously. "You see, having a baby now is fucking impossible. It's just impossible. It would probably be impossible to bear it healthy. We'd have to survive from ruble to kopeck, from bread to potatoes. How will the fetus develop with such nutrition? What will we feed it when it is born? What to dress it in and what to raise it on? We're on a budget right now. But a child is a very big expense, and to raise him in poverty is just unfair." Agreed. "So I consulted my mom." "But why didn't you consult me?" asked Stephen. "Or do I have nothing to do with this child?" "Come on, Lisa," almost insulted. "Who is, if not you? Don't make it up. It's just women's business. It's not customary to discuss them with men." "Stephen, this decision was very hard for me, wasn't it? But now it's the only sensible way out of the situation. And we'll have a baby for sure, just a little later, in a few years. The doctor said that today's operation will not affect the possibility of conception in the future." She said something else. But Thompson wasn't listening. A crushing sense of guilt came over him. Once again, he had missed something. Failed to save his child's life. He had failed to see it through. He realized there was nothing Lisa could say against him. She's right about everything. Their family's really struggling to get by, to stay afloat. Having a baby is guaranteed to drag them down at their current income. But damn it, how could he have missed it? He focused only on the present moment, on making sure there was something to eat in the house every day, that there was no debt accumulating and all bills were paid on time, that there was some minimal emergency stash like buying a new jacket or shoes, and did not think at all about the future, about work for the future, and even that this future in the form of pregnancy can come so suddenly, too, did not think. And so he missed it, and he wanted a child so badly. Along with guilt came resentment toward Lisa. Why didn't she consult him? Did she think he was so worthless and useless by default, so incapable of providing for a full family, so useless that she doesn't even see fit to discuss his child's future with him? A greater blow to a man's ego could not be imagined. Lisa, as if she had read her husband's thoughts, spoke up. "I didn't want to burden you with this, Stephen," she said guiltily. "I see how much you do for us, how hard you work. You're working your ass off. You're doing the best you can in our situation, and even, it seems, more than you can. I understand how much effort you put into making sure we don't go hungry. But I realize nowadays only businessmen make money, and you and I aren't cut out for it. I didn't want to worry you too much." But Stephen wasn't listening again. All he could think about was that he had once again wronged his family. He had already allowed the death of his grandmother, and now he had failed to preserve his firstborn, to provide him with normal conditions for birth. Of course, any person looking at things objectively would say that Stephen is not to blame for these deaths. But how easy it is to reason objectively when you are outside the situation, not inside it. Stephen was firmly convinced of his responsibility for everything that had happened, and immediately swore to himself that he would not make such mistakes again. The next day, he called an acquaintance who offered him a job as a shift worker, and a couple of weeks later, having passed all the interviews and medical examinations, he left on his first business trip. Since then, the family's life has gotten better little by little. The money Stephen brought back was enough not only for basic needs, but also for more serious things. They renovated the apartment, where the three of them continued to live. They renovated the furniture, changed their clothes, and bought some household appliances. Once a year, Stephen took his women to the sea. Favoring foreign resorts became available. Lisa went to work from the library of the school to a private gymnasium. The pay was better and more regular. The gymnasium was a bit far from home, and Stephen bought his wife a car to make it easier for her to get there. Of course, not a foreign car, but a simple copy of the domestic car industry. But it was still better. I'm always late. Broken and perpetually overcrowded public transportation. Stephen was terribly afraid for his wife, ever since the accident that killed his parents. The man had never learned to trust cars. But Lisa drove carefully and with great confidence, and in her few years of driving experience, she'd never been in an accident. So Thompson settled down. Every time, receiving a salary, Stephen remembered a kind word Baba Toma did not persuade her and great-grandson to get a profession. Where would he be now? Slowly he managed. In the village, where after the collapse of the kolkhoz everything came to a complete shambles, or would have broken the coven on loading wagons and occasional repairs in the city. Thank you. This he has already tried, and now he knows for sure that it is impossible to live on earnings from these coven even alone. And you can't even think about starting and keeping a family. Evelyn was right when she insisted on sending his little fool to study in the city. She could have persuaded her great-grandson to get a higher education. He'd be an engineer at the same oil company now, earning 3 times as much. Then he and Lisa would have had a child 2 years ago. Then they wouldn't have had to choose between a long, cheap course of recuperation after that unfortunate abortion and a quick but much more expensive one. But that's okay. The important thing is that they found a way out, even on the current budget. And doctors give optimistic prognosis. And about higher education, he will think when the first child is born. I mean, you can study by correspondence. Evelyn would definitely approve. Life got better. They stopped counting pennies, were able to afford better and more varied products, more modern medicines. They even started preparing for pregnancy. Stephen insisted that Lisa be seen by a competent and renowned reproductive gynecologist at a fee-for-service medical center. And it didn't matter that they had to sell the village house because Stephen's work schedule didn't allow to keep an eye on it. And the fact that how wistful and sad it was, and on business trips away from his beloved wife. From his family, also unimportant. These trifles can be taken out of the brackets, Stephen thought. After all, something has to be sacrificed to achieve a better life. There's no such thing as no sacrifice at all. Well, he sacrificed his childhood, his memory of the past, his peace of mind in order that his family would not need anything and grow children. And that sacrifice seems to be accepted. He finally seems to be doing well. And even the doctor said he could try to conceive on this vacation. His wife's body is fully prepared. In dreams of a future baby, Stephen went up to his floor, opened the door with his key and shouted from the threshold, "Lisa, Mommy Emily, I'm back." Thompson awoke around noon. He stretched happily in the soft, comfortable bed, breathed in the aroma of fresh-baked goods wafting under the room door. Emily had been witching in the kitchen since morning, eager to pamper her son-in-law. Stephen arrived and smiled. It seemed he had an adored cinnamon apple bun waiting for him. It was so good to be home at his place. After tidying himself up, the man poked his nose into the kitchen and realized he had guessed right. A handful of warm, oozing, mind-blowingly scented buns rose on a platter in the middle of the table. Stephen reached out his hand, about to kick one of them. Immediately, he received a playful towel across the palm of his hand from Emily. "Hold on, just a bit," said his mother-in-law with a smile. "Let them cool down a bit. Lisa will be here soon, and we'll have lunch." "Where is she?" asked the son-in-law resignedly, and poured himself some coffee. "She went to the doctor's office this morning," the mother-in-law explained. "She hasn't been since you left. I bought some vitamins. She's been exercising like he told her to. Now she'll have a checkup and find out if she can have a baby. Just in time for you to come back. That's good timing. Something's delayed. She was gone by 900 hours. I'm getting worried." Emily faltered, remembering Stephen, movies, fear of car accidents. But after a minute it became clear that the old woman was worried for a reason. The phone rang. Stephen picked up the receiver and heard a man's voice. "Thompson's apartment. Police Captain Christopher is also concerned about Thompson. Elizaveta Stepanovna. Who is your wife?" "You, Stephen, it must be." The voice slowed down and softened a bit. "Stephen, you need to come to the identification. Write down the address, 16 Komsomolskaya Street. Entrance from the courtyard." "Is there a police station there?" Stephen asked the stern voice. He knew the Komsomolskaya neighborhood quite well, but he couldn't remember the 16th house. Not quite. The voice hesitated a little, but continued. There's a forensic medical examination department and a morgue. Can you get there in an hour? I'll meet you at the entrance. Stephen carefully put the receiver on the lever and threw a quick glance at his mother-in-law. She was sluggishly at the stove and didn't seem to be listening to the conversation. Perhaps I won't bother her for the time being, the man decided. Forensic medicine isn't necessarily a morgue. Lisa may have had an accident or been attacked by someone, and now the damage needs to be removed. That's what forensics does. The word identification, uttered by the captain, Stephen diligently chased out of his mind. Emily, he said, trying to keep his voice as steady as possible. Lisa will be late. I need to go and help her. You promised not to wait without us. He finished and hurried into his room to get ready. Alas, Thompson's hopes were not realized. He was expected at the morgue to identify the body of his wife. I guess this is my curse. To lose loved ones in car accidents without a vital voice, said Stephen. All at home to a tired pathologist sitting in his office. First his parents crashed their car, now his wife. After all, as he felt that he should not buy her this nine. But I wanted what was best. Strictly speaking, objected the medic, raising his head from the form, which he filled out during the conversation. It was the other way around. First your wife's death, and then the accident. The autopsy showed that the cause of death was a blood clot, blockage in pulmonary artery. It happens. Blood vessels often clot, especially with sedentary behavior and high cholesterol. And then a slight increase in blood pressure is enough. As a result of strong excitement, for example, or just an awkward movement, and the clot breaks away from its attachment point, begins to move through the veins and arteries. It carries blood, you know, and it can go to the heart or the pulmonary artery, and then the person dies. That's what happened to your wife. She died from a blood clot. It caused the car to go out of control, which in turn caused the accident. Likewise, she could have died on the sidewalk, in a bakery, or even sitting on the couch at home, if the pressure spike had caught her in those places. So don't be so quick to blame yourself, young man. The pathologist put an ornate signature on the certificate, slapped a stamp on top of it, and nodded towards the door, inviting Stephen to follow him. The registrar stamped the rest, and Thompson received Lisa's death certificate. With this document, you will now go to the registry office, and they will issue you a death certificate. You have your spouse's passport with you. You'll need it there too. And already on the basis of the certificate, you will be able to prepare for the funeral. Place in the cemetery to buy, farewell table to order. But it's up to you. Oh, and take this list. It lists the things you'll need to bring to the morgue when you decide on the date of the funeral. Clothes, shoes, bedspreads, that sort of thing. Our orderlies will prepare the bodies. Give them whatever you collect. Stephen nodded. He obediently took the papers, mumbled a farewell, and walked toward the exit. Waiting for him outside was his buddy Christopher, one of the guys who worked with him on the crew. Christopher had recently buried his grandfather and had not yet had time to forget the whole ritual kitchen. He knew what and in what organization to formalize, what documents will be required, where to order a farewell and wake, how to communicate with the cemetery authorities. In short, he would have made a perfect funeral agent, but he undertook to help Stephen for free, simply out of friendship. When the latter, completely confused, called a colleague to ask for advice. In addition, Christopher had a car, and with him funeral troubles became not only clearer, but also faster. Let me see what you've been given. Christopher took the papers from Stephen's hands, looked through them quickly. Yeah, okay. Do you have your passport, Lisa? And your marriage license? But I'm good, so we're going to the registry office. We'll be there before lunch. Thompson sank into the front seat and began to consider what he'd learned from the pathologist. A clot, okay. A blood clot probably could indeed have formed. Lisa does have a sedentary job. What about the blood pressure spike? I don't think she's ever complained about it. Christopher was tactfully silent. I didn't want to distract him from the road with my doubts. Stephen began to mindlessly study the certificate issued by the morgue, wandered his eyes over the bank, not particularly considering in the line heading surname, first name, patronymic, date, cause of death, and suddenly shuddered. Pregnancy was written in the Associated Pathologies column in the not neat but legible handwriting of the medical professional. Christopher Thompson almost jumped in his seat. "Christopher, turn around. We have to get back to the morgue." The gray-haired, tired pathologist was thankfully still in his office. "Yes, pregnancy," he confirmed, stunned at Stephen. "Absolutely correct. There can be no mistake. I've worked with your wife's body myself, and I remember the due date of 8-9 weeks perfectly. In fact, I can show you if you have any doubts, but I wouldn't want to embarrass you with the sight. I'm very sorry for your loss." But Stephen wasn't listening. 8-9 weeks is 2 months at the most. He'd been away for 3. "Oh, Lisa, what have you done?" She was probably told about the baby's future at her checkup at the medical center. So much for the excitement and the blood pressure spike that sent the clot on its gruesome journey. Damn it. Blinken Medical Center confirmed the hunch. After a visit from the gynecologist, Christopher finally took Thompson to the registry office. "Anyway, Stephen," he said, "you'll have to do the funeral. After all, you love this woman, so you must give her a proper burial. And will you or won't you deal with the rest of the circumstances later? It doesn't matter now. So pull yourself together, brother. We got things to do." Stephen Soka nodded and set off on his way through the instances. The man returned home only in the evening. He released the neighbor who was looking after his mother-in-law, gave Emily a list of things from the morgue. For a while, together with her, he picked up everything he needed from the leasing closet. Emily was tearful and a little lethargic from the sedative drugs with which her neighbor had stuffed her. But the deed, even if so mournful, distracted her and cheered her up considerably. Having finished with the preparations, she dragged her son-in-law into the kitchen to feed him dinner for company and skewered herself. All day a piece of food hadn't fit down her throat. "Stephen," she only sighed with tea. "She gave me tea, but I couldn't drink it. You can't do that." "Emily," Stephen said sternly, "you and I are going to need our strength. Are you going to starve yourself?" After supper, Thompson brought the papers he had collected during the day and selected a photocopy of the morgue certificate. The original had been taken at the registry office, but he had managed to copy the report and a copy of Lisa's statement from the medical center. Emily had the same idea. Cautiously, he began. "I need to talk to you. The doctor said that Lisa was pregnant." He recounted everything he had learned today, showed his mother-in-law the documents. The elderly woman came, studied the certificates, sank her gaze and sighed. "Now, of course, it doesn't matter anymore," Thompson said in the meantime. "But still I want to know. I've been on watch for 3 months, and I'm 2 months pregnant. Tell me honestly, did Lisa have someone steady, or was it a random mistake? A one-time thing, so to speak?" From the way Emily's cheeks flushed, the way her gaze flickered, Stephen realized a one-off was out of the question. Lisa had a steady lover. However, the mother-in-law was in no hurry to tell about him. Stephen had to make a lot of effort to get his relative to talk. "The second year they meet in person," finally said Emily. They met at Lisa's gymnasium. He brought his little brother there to study. They have a large family. He is the oldest of the brothers. The younger one just started school. "You know, family is very important for a woman." Stephen raised an ironic eyebrow. "And Lisa and I said, 'Family is not important to her,'" he said. "But what kind of family is it?" My mother-in-law exclaimed sorrowfully. "You're always at work. You're always at work." And a woman, she needs her husband, was constantly around to feel support, to talk, to consult. Yes, want to go to the theater on the weekend, was with whom to go with. "Has your family been a hotel for a long time? So how can I be on the road all the time by my own will?" Stephen was indignant. "I earn money for this family for a normal life. For the same theaters, after all." "I understand, Stephen," the mother-in-law said softly. And Lisa understood that and was very grateful to you for it. She was just tired of being alone. That's why she couldn't resist when he started to show her some attention. He wooed her very nicely. You know, date bouquets, and an interesting conversationalist. He's got a college degree. And erudite, very understanding and tactful. You can literally talk to him about anything. Even about food prices, even about the classics of world painting Lisa talked about. She rests her body and soul with him. Stephen chuckled. And if only so. Emily stood up for her daughter. After all, they had a serious relationship. So why did she noodle around with me for so long? If it was serious. Thompson was indignant. It's not a household or serfdom nowadays. If she had told me everything, I wouldn't have kept it. Divorced and please, build your serious relationship with whoever you want. If I'm no good at lying, why? You see, Stephen. The mother-in-law apparently decided to be completely honest with him. Lisa really wanted a real big family. And Sergei, but that man, he was also set on a big family. And to have many children, he was used to living in a large family. He grew up with that attitude, you know. Well, there you go. And Lisa wasn't very good with kids, you know, after that abortion. So she thought it was only fair that she get pregnant and get treatment on your dime. And when she's fully healthy, she'll tell you everything and file for divorce after all. The problems with the pregnancy started after she had an abortion from you. So it's your fault, even if indirectly. Sergei has a decent income, don't you think? He could treat Lisa without a problem. But it wouldn't be right to make him fix your mistakes, wouldn't it? Stephen was so stunned by his mother-in-law's words that he felt no rage or even the slightest irritation. All emotions seemed to leave his body at once. All thoughts were gone from his head. His face turned into a lifeless mask. His voice was gone, and even his breathing stopped for a few moments. It seemed to him that he had been thrown with all his might into a hole of cold water, and now his whole body. My whole mind was focused on one thing. To surface, to take a breath of air, and go to the bottom. And so he, too, at that moment, was using all his strength to keep his sanity and calm in a world that had suddenly turned upside down for him. He could have said that he was not to blame for the abortion that Lisa had performed without even consulting him. But at his mother's instigation, he could have told her how much he wanted that child, how frightened he was for his wife when he saw her bleeding, how discouraged Stephen was when he found out the truth. He could have said that Lisa should have done nothing to start by voicing her grievances about frequent weaning to him and working together to find some sort of solution before falling into the arms of a random suitor. About how he himself loved his family, how he longed for them when he was away, how he wanted children, a big house, and how he stayed day and night to turn that dream into a reality. He saw no point in telling. It seemed to him that it had been understood as it was originally always. Well, it turned out it had only seemed so. It was his fault again. So if he had been there, Lisa wouldn't have gotten a lover, wouldn't have gotten pregnant by him, wouldn't have been scared of the pregnancy, wouldn't have had a blood pressure spike, wouldn't have had that unfortunate blood clot, and she would be alive. Failed again. Thompson failed again. So don't think about it. It's bullshit. It's not true. He's not the one who put his wife under the unknown Sergei. After all, it was Lisa's choice and only Lisa's. A lover and a lie. It is not and cannot be his fault. Emily eyed her son-in-law warily. As she began the story, she feared that Stephen would become scandalized, violent, perhaps even fight. That would be a natural reaction for a man of his level of culture, the older woman thought. She had always been a little condescending toward her son-in-law, believing that a country boy without higher education was incapable of any high feelings or subtle movements of the soul. But shouting with his fist on the table or on the wall would be quite normal for him in this situation, Emily thought. Even though Stephen had never once raised his voice in front of her, let alone made any kind of scandal. And now Thompson sat still and silent, and then leaned back in his chair, leaning the back of his head against the wall, and took a deep breath, obviously trying to calm himself down. Emily realized that there would be no scandal, and dared from this understanding. Dared to ask Stephen. Cautiously, she said, "Say, would you mind if Sergei comes to the funeral of Lisa?" What did not understand Sergei? Repeated mother-in-law. I called him, told him what had happened. He'd like to come to the funeral. Think about it. But they loved each other so much. It's not human not to let him say goodbye to Lisa. Emily, Thompson said slowly, looking into his mother-in-law's eyes. Do you realize what you're saying? What are you asking? I'm asking you to be honorable to your spouse and rival. The woman replied. If, of course, you know the concept of honor, Stephen thought. What kind of relatives I always have who want to play the game of nobility. One of them would kick his own daughter out of the house and call his grandson a gunman and scum. The second, hiding under the guise of nobility, asking me to spit on my own dignity. However, both of them are not relatives for a long time. And this is already a stranger. Except for the upcoming funeral, we have nothing else to do with her. The main thing is to endure the funeral. Stephen stood up, waved his hand, and went to his room, closing the door tightly behind him. But even this precaution did not help. Even on the bed, he could hear his mother-in-law talking into the phone. The funeral the day after tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Yes, Stephen didn't mind, and Thompson pulled the pillow over his head. But the voice continued to echo in his ears, thrashing around inside his skull, as if trying to shatter it from the inside out. The man tried to make it subside, but as soon as he pushed it himself, thoughts of Lisa, her lovers, her strange sense of justice rose in his mind. Her lies are straight. About an hour, Stephen got up, walked to the kitchen, took out a bottle of vodka from the refrigerator, poured a glass, and drank it in one gulp. He stood, thought for a moment, and repeated the operation again, not paying attention to the settled eyes of the mother-in-law sitting at the table. After that, he went back to the room, collapsed on the bed, and finally passed out. An unexpectedly large number of people had gathered for the funeral. Teachers from the gymnasium, students with whom she was friends, came to see Lisa off. Classmates, some friends, acquaintances, and neighbors. Stephen knew almost none of them. These were the things going through his head. There's your proof. You know nothing at all about your wife's life. If you'd been sitting at home with her, you'd know who's best friend, who's an acquaintance from the medical center, and who's a former classmate. You missed it all while you were driving. What did you think for the good of the family? Where's your family now? Yeah, it showed up. Stephen tried to push those thoughts away and focus on what was happening. But after a while, he realized that it would be better to immerse himself in reflection and indulge himself. And now, instead of heartily grieving for the woman he loved and with whom he lived not one happy year, he stares intently at the men present and agonizingly tries to guess who, which of them. Where is he, this Sergei? To look at his face, to understand, for whom the covenant changed. He began to watch the movements of his mother-in-law, who the girlfriends he knew were talking to, the reactions of those gathered to each other. There was no way a close friend could be so good at hiding her affair. Some of the women present surely knew about it, couldn't help but know. Perhaps their looks or words would give away a rival. And the degree. Why the hell would you want that? He tried to calm himself down, but after a couple minutes he noticed that he was busy looking again. He already wanted to approach Emily and ask her directly where the same Sergei was. The only thing that stopped the man was his unwillingness to humiliate himself in front of his mother-in-law. However, by the end of the procedures at the cemetery, Thompson was ready for that. And only after leaving the cemetery fence, he began to think a little. Let's rest and move. Christopher approached and clapped his buddy on the shoulder. Sympathetic. Or are you going to take the bus with everyone to the wake? Stephen inhaled and again fixed his eyes on the crowd of people going to their cars. Then he let the smoke out, shook his head as if to dispel his thoughts. I'm not going to the wake, he said resolutely. I'll go completely crazy there. Take me somewhere else, Christopher. No problem, responded his colleague. Where are you going? Home. Yes? Is that even a thing? I didn't realize it at first, Stephen. No, Christopher, I can't stand the bottom of it now. Where to? Who the hell knows? Some hotel, I guess. Take it tonight. Then I'll find a house where I can rent before the shift. What do you think, renting a place for such a short period of time? Listen, you don't need a hotel. After thinking, said Christopher, waste money and no peace at all. Let me take you to your grandfather's apartment. It still stands empty after him to inherit. The deadline hasn't come yet. Of course, we could rent it out without that. But you know, I don't have enough time to sort it all out, to put things in order, to put some things in, some to throw out. Let's do it that way. You live there, and you'll help me with the sorting out of things as payment. It's good for me, and it's good for you. I'll do it. Let's do it, Stephen nodded. He didn't really care about his mother-in-law. But the apartment will still have to be visited, things to pack. All the stuff in Thompson fit into 4 large plaid bags, 2 for clothes, 1 for tools, books, and other boyish necessities. And the last things he'd picked up before the sale from his parents' country home. There were albums with photos of his mother, a warm shawl, Evelyn's favorite cup, the chess game he and his father played in the evenings, something else that had no material value but held the memory of his childhood. The only seemingly happy period of Stephen's life. All those years of work, and not a damn thing to show for it. He grinned, looking at the bags. But it wasn't heavy to carry, Christopher said optimistically. He picked up 2 points out of 4 and hurried down the stairs. Stephen put the keys to the apartment on the kitchen table, picked up the 2 remaining bags, and carefully slammed the front door shut. He followed his buddy. After about half an hour, the foreign car slowed down in the quiet city center in front of a tall house of Stalinist construction. Whatever state Stephen was in, he could not help but marvel at the place of arrival. And after they entered the luxurious entrance with wide wrought iron staircases, went up to the right floor on an elevator with an open door, which Thompson had only seen in movies before, and entered the apartment, where the hallway was larger than his mother-in-law's kitchen. The man had it all sorted out, and curiosity passed. Examining himself, Christopher hospitably offered, putting a bulky bag on the floor, "I'll make some tea." There are no groceries here, of course, but tea and sugar should have remained. Or a quick trip to the store. But Stephen was already wandering around the apartment, and so he didn't hear his friend's question. He had never been in such places before, though he could assess the situation. The apartment seemed to have come off the screens. A movie about the life of the late 50s. High ceilings, massive wooden furniture, carved sideboard behind glass cabinets with books, from the shelves of which matte sheen, knotted gold inscriptions. Leather spines, a sofa with a carved wooden back and valances, a desk with bombshells, and tabletops behind a glass cloth. On the table, a papier and jasper press and writing instrument, a table lamp with green lampshades, portraits. On the walls, not photographs, but specifically oil portraits, red carpeting. Time seems to have stopped here and is not going to flow any further. It's sickening to catch up with the sum total. And the 90s. Good decision, by the way, Stephen thought. It's more peaceful that way. The front door slammed in the hallway. Bags rustled. Christopher still ran to the store, and a minute later had already hooked up the refrigerator in the kitchen, surprisingly modern enough, and loaded the food into it. "I knew you wouldn't even notice I was gone," he grinned. "But what do you think of the new place? Impressive." "You bet it is." Stephen confirmed it. "I've never seen anything like it in person, only in a movie or a museum." "Hey, what's it all about? Who was your grandfather?" Christopher shrugged his shoulders, poured water into a kettle, put it on the burners of the gas stove. "Grandfather?" he asked again. "My grandfather was a KGB man. Well, that is, first as a Chekist, then as a military intelligence officer, and then he had a good rank in the KGB. He was old, My grandfather is the same age as my grandfather. He didn't live to be 100, and he didn't leave the service until the last moment. Only just before the putsch he agreed to retire. He was bored sitting at home alone. His grandmother died early. She wasn't 60 yet. He loved her dearly. He didn't marry a second time, though there were those who wanted to, believe me. But he didn't. The department provided him with a housekeeper. He had someone to look after the apartment, but it was a forced measure, you know. But he wouldn't have tolerated any other woman but his grandmother. I spent almost all my childhood here, Christopher continued, picking up the table. My parents were always traveling, on expeditions. They were archaeologists. I had all kinds of ancient burials to dig up around the world. They died of some infection unknown to Soviet science. They brought it from Africa. No grandfather's connections, no doctors helped. Well, I was in my 20s then. I knew how to live on my own. And when I was little, I lived here all the time. I know every nook and cranny of the furniture. And now my wife says, let's renovate the ice apartment, throw out all the junk, buy new furniture, and move in. Of course, it's more spacious than our one room. And the neighborhood's upscale. Do you believe me? No, I can't. For her, it's a piece of junk. For me, it's half my life. I remember my grandfather working at this table, on this couch, reading me a book before bed, how I did my homework, about the secrets in the living room, how I learned to cook on this stove. And it's all these memories to throw away too. But you said you were going to take everything apart and turn it in, didn't you? Stephen asked, perplexed. I decided to put the kettle on the table solemnly, said Christopher. I will take apart two things, put aside what is valuable and memorable for me, and the rest is sold off to understanding people for furniture. Their paintings, these books have connoisseurs. So far I've recognized. And the furniture is good. And then you'll get a crew in here. Let them do the repairs and furnishings themselves, without me, and let her look for tenants and decide everything with them. Let this apartment become different, alien, faceless. But I won't see it, you understand, because I won't be able to look at it. I understand, nodded Stephen, and began to tell his friend about his parents' house in the village, about how he tried to save it to the last, how reverent and respectful Evelyn had been of that wish, and how he still blamed himself for selling the house, as if he had betrayed his childhood, his family. Christopher understood and sympathized with him. Stephen spoke and felt that he was getting better, that the pain was going away and the tension of the last few days was subsiding. Despair and images from the funeral became paler, as if dissolved in front of vivid childhood memories. We ate dinner, drank tea, and switched to cognac. Hell, I'll drink with you, decisively said Christopher, arranging the shot glasses. I'll call a cab, if anything. And in the extreme, and here I will fall down, Poddy, do not kick out. He mockingly looked at his friend. Only if he promises not to sing loudly. Stephen answered in the same tone. I've hated snoring since I was a kid. Hey, too bad. You wouldn't be surprised with my grandfather, grinned Christopher. He was wheezing. The walls shook. He was a good man, actually. I miss him. Although, you know, I think he died just in time. He probably wouldn't have liked the modern way of life as KGB, Stephen suggested. He didn't like it, confirmed his buddy. But that wasn't the point. It's just that Granddad had started to go a bit head over heels in recent years. Remember, at one time there was a wave of revelations of KGB and Cheka workers. They brought up some documents, supposedly deeply classified. They published memoirs of dissidents, repressed people, all sorts of horrors. They wrote about particularly brutal interrogations and atrocities of the staff. Do you remember? It still comes up sometimes. Thompson nodded. But Christopher agreed. Grandfather heard about it. Read a few articles, so worried, he kept saying that they would come for him and take revenge. Maybe he was worried for a reason. I'm sure it wasn't for nothing. You must have read what went on in those departments in the 1930s and 40s. I'm sure he had his share of sins. I calmed him down as best I could, but he was more and more afraid every day. My grandfather was afraid. I couldn't imagine such a thing in my life. And after a while, suddenly he got so angry and belligerent. He was still afraid, but he'd tell him to come. I'm no stranger to the world. I've prepared a surprise for them. Let's see who's going to send who to the other side. I tortured him. I tortured him about what he was talking about. But you didn't. What can I do against an old scout? He was getting worse every month. The apartment was a mess. A mess. He slept on the sofa in the study, often in his clothes. He never went into the bedroom, even kept the windows shut. He only left the house to get the newspapers. Tracked him. So if they wrote that about him with a newspaper in his hand, he died. I've looked through it all. There was nothing about the Cheka or the KGB in it at all. But that's what gave him a heart attack. Maybe he was just tired of being afraid. We had a drink. We were quiet. Then they went back to reminiscing about their childhood and the old men who had expressed them. It seems they hardly drank at all. But suddenly it was dark outside the window. It was nearing 0 o'clock on the clock, and Stephen was so groggy that he was ready to lie his head on the table and pass out. Christopher looked more awake. At least he had enough to call a cab, get them to his office and lay them on the couch with leather valanky, and even clean up his desk a little. How was he leaving? Stephen could no longer hear Thompson either. He woke up close to dawn, disgustingly sober and even without any signs of a hangover. Woke up wondering, where am I? What is this place? He raised his head, looked around perplexed. He woke up finally and suddenly remembered everything at once. My return from a business trip, a happy meeting with my wife, cinnamon buns with apples, the police captain's call, the cold morgue, the pathologist's office, a conversation with my mother-in-law, the funeral. The events of the last few days arose in his mind at the same time the boy almost suffocated at their arrival. For a while he sat on the couch, frantically gulping air with his mouth. Then he bent in half and vomited right onto the red carpet. But no sooner had he moved in, he'd already made a mess of the apartment. He thought grimly to himself, "You're always being unmanly. Thompson, everything's not human. Everything's a mess. You're always screwing up everything you don't pick yourself up for and failing to keep what you're given. You couldn't keep your parents because of you. They took a car ride into town. Did you ask for a special toy for a holiday gift that wasn't available at the local store? If you'd been a little more sure of what you wanted, wouldn't have had that trip and therefore the accident. You couldn't keep your grandmother. You stopped taking care of her. You left her alone in the village and she died. You failed to keep your firstborn child because you failed to instill confidence in your wife and did not provide her with everything she needed for a peaceful life. You didn't keep the house where you spent your childhood because I chased after the big bucks and didn't have the time to maintain it. Didn't keep your family together. Didn't give his wife the attention she deserved. And she found a lover. And he didn't save his wife. Gave in to her demands. Bought her that stupid car. After all, if the clot had broken off somewhere in a public place or at home, and she would have been ill, people nearby, perhaps, would have had time to call an ambulance, and Lisa would still be alive. And she might have gone to someone else, but she would still be alive. It's you. It's all your fault. Such thoughts were running through Stephen's head, and he couldn't cope with them. A young, healthy, handsome man with a good job and a normal income. He sat on the sofa in someone else's apartment and thought about the fact that his life seemed to be over. He had nothing left dear to his heart. Not a single loved one, not even a corner of his own. And he had only himself to blame. All his life he had done nothing but make mistake after mistake, even though all he wanted was to have a family and be happy in it. Was that too much to ask? If someone had been around at that moment, they would have explained to him that it was not his fault. The death of his parents was nothing more than a tragic accident. His grandmother's death would not have depended on his presence and constant care. Evelyn was already at a very advanced age. In addition, she felt that she had completed the main task in her life, raising and raising her grandson. There was simply nothing else in the world for her. Marriage to Lisa, and it was doomed from the start. She did not put her husband in a penny, considered herself much higher than him, and agreed to his proposal only because she was panic-stricken of being alone. All her friends had already gotten married, and no one had asked her. It was a shame. Meanwhile, Mom was getting old, and one day she would be gone. And Lisa had no one else. So let there be someone. She never really loved her husband, nor did she respect him. That's why she didn't tell him about the first child. She had a lover and took fertility treatments at Stephen for money. To marry this lover, already being healthy, and guaranteed to give birth to his children, and not to swap a chump for a chump. Thompson could explain all of this. I mean Christopher, or maybe Stephen would have thought of it himself. Just a few years later, after his emotions had subsided, his mind had become clear, and he had accumulated a little life experience and wisdom. And having realized all this, he would be able to finally calm down and meet a woman with similar goals and create, finally, the very family strong and loving, which he has always dreamed of. After all, such families only arise when a person has peace, clarity, and strength inside, rather than all-consuming guilt and fear. One more time to be wrong could be, but that was the only time Stephen didn't have. Giving in to hysterics, he rolled around on the sofa, pounded his fists on its back, sobbed, shouted something, pounded his head against the wall. What am I supposed to do now? What am I supposed to do now? Are you in favor of Pilon? Once again, I typed my forehead into the wallpaper above the couch. I missed a little, caught my head on the corner of the portrait frame hanging over the headboard. The portrait swayed from the impact and suddenly snapped off its mount and plummeted down flat onto the leather seat, then slid to the floor. So much for another destruction, Stephen thought habitually, and froze, looking closely at the wall. In the light twilight, a small opening was clearly visible in it. The niche was uncovered, no door. Thompson crawled closer on his knees and cautiously peered inside. With a trembling hand, he took out a heavy and brightly colored bundle from the catch he had discovered, laid it on his knees, unfolded it, and stood still, scrutinizing the find. The black old revolver was nodding against the oily quiver with a match sheen. What a surprise grandfather had in store for possible enemies. It flashed through the man's mind. That was why he slept in the study, so that the gun would always be at hand. Stop. If that's the case, it must be a working man. A quick inspection showed the revolver lubricated and loaded. Thompson put the barrel to the cushion lying on the sofa, cocked the trigger, and fired. For a while he looked at the bullet hole and the bullet itself, which had passed through the fluff and lodged in the couch. Great, he thought. That answers the question of what to do now. Stephen had always gotten at most a C in shooting in his elementary military training classes at school. But now, thank God, he didn't have to aim. Thompson made himself comfortable on the shot pillow, cocked the trigger, put the muzzle of the revolver in his mouth, and fired.